my friends are simps.
Back at the end of 2023, there was a lot of excitement surrounding the release of the KO2, aka the EP133 from Teenage Engineering, a device which, for me anyway, seemed like a natural evolution of the ideas found in the small but mighty PO33 KO pocket operator. Now, whatever you might think about Teenage Engineering, it would be fair to say that they continue to produce some of the most talked about, if not the most interesting and unusual electronic instruments out there. And true to form, I don't think anybody really expected them to follow up the freshly minted KO2 with a very specific medieval themed version. Like many of you, I questioned what on earth this was all about because it seemed completely out of left field, and to be honest, quite a bizarre choice. However, it also really piqued my curiosity because I love weird and wonderful bits of gear. So a few months ago, I managed to convince Teenage Engineering, despite all of the things I've said about them in the past, to send me one over to have a play about with, and in this video, I'm going to be sharing some of my thoughts as well as a general kind of overview. There is actually quite a lot going on with this thing, and so a lot to speak about, and as a result I've added chapter markers below so that you can skip around as you desire. This is intended to be more of a review or a feature video as opposed to a tutorial or a walkthrough, so if that's what you're after, then I can recommend the excellent series from Sun Wu, though obviously I think you should watch this through to the end as well. Without any further ado, whilst I am not usual one for unboxing style videos, in this case I've decided to make an exception because the packaging is actually very nicely put together. The presentation has all of the aura of an intricately decorated holy book, and I really love the medieval style artwork on the front in particular. I think it's fantastic. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of thought has clearly gone into the design of this, and Teenage Engineering have gone all in with a medieval theme with wee details like specific custom LED symbols. The function names and the buttons are marked in what is meant to resemble Latin or, ye olde English, I guess. As a Scotsman, that's not really my forte. And this follows through into the style of the quick start guide and the manual. To be honest, this does make it a wee bit trickier to get your head around, especially with some of the more involved features, but as annoying as that can be, it is also kind of part of the fun, and I deeply appreciate the commitment to the bit. The design of the keys is especially cool on here, and I love the ornate styling on the letters, even though they don't have the indicators for the secondary functions like copy and paste that are found on the KO2. But I'm willing to forgive that because they just look so good. Bizarrely enough, the brown keys on here apparently smell of chocolate, and so I dutifully gave them a deep snifter. Whether or not I'm just experiencing some kind of placebo, I feel like I can detect a very faint cocoa-like whiff, although it is entirely possible that this whole thing is an elaborate troll, and if so, I respect that. As you can see, the EP1320 comes with 4 colour-coded knobs that you install yourself. 3 of these are for the pots on the top, and 1 is for the fader on the bottom left-hand side. The first 3 slid on dead easily, however I did have some trouble with the final one. Specifically, the inside of the fader knob was just so tight that there's no way that it was going to fit on the shaft without me applying some significant force. And it seemed like something would almost certainly break if I was to do that. Now, this has been a well-documented problem with the KO2, and so I was a bit surprised to see that it was still an issue on the medieval version. But either way, I was prepared for this, and so I dutifully cracked out a Phillips screwdriver to hammer the inside of the knob and widen out the grooves. Unfortunately, even after I had given the thing the old screwdriver treatment, it really wasn't for going on there easily at all. I got the knob about halfway down the shaft before I got stuck, and at that point, I realised that I'd kind of fallen into this unfortunate middle ground where I couldn't really push it down any further with quite a bit of pressure, but I also couldn't pull on it because it seemed like I would damage the component's connections to the circuit board. In the end, I did manage to gradually tease it and wiggle it down after spraying some contact cleaner and stuff in there and very carefully moving it back and forward, which is a bit of a shame because so much thought has clearly gone into all of the other details of this thing. And this kind of runs the risk of overshadowing that. Anyway, I got it on in the end fine, and everything seems to have been working completely as you would expect since then, but it's definitely something you should be aware of before getting one, because if you aren't and then you just try and jam the knob on there, then that probably isn't going to have a very happy ending. In terms of connectivity, we've got separate inputs and outputs on mini jack for analog synchronization, MIDI communication and stereo audio. There is also a USB-C connection which can be used to power the device, send and receive MIDI data, and also transfer samples using the dedicated web sample tool, which I'll come on to talk about a wee bit more later. If you want to get truly portable, then there's a built-in speaker, and you can also power the device using 4 AA batteries. The gist of the EP1320 is that it's this kind of quirky, portable, but also surprisingly capable sampler and arranger that has got velocity-sensitive pads and 6 simultaneous stereo voices or 12 monophonic ones. True to its theme, it comes preloaded with hundreds of medieval samples that you can pick from, including the jangling of chains, big resonant drums, and various screams of what could either be pain or pleasure, depending on your own interpretation, or perhaps, I guess, your own preference. The quality of these samples is actually pretty good, and there is a decent variety in there. So, you know, if you're a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, maybe you write tunes for Renaissance fairs, or maybe you just want to make peasant techno like me, then, you know, in those kinds of cases, I can see how appealing these samples would be. They really capture that, you know, the good-humoured Game of Thrones-esque thing pretty well. Now, whilst the built-in sounds are good fun, you aren't just limited to using them alone, as you can sample directly into the EP1320 using either the built-in microphone or the audio input. Alternatively, you can also use the dedicated online sample transfer tool to drag and drop files from your computer, and as something of a very lazy man, this has been a godsend because the tool is actually pretty good. It's really quick and easy to use, and has also been designed quite nicely, so if you connect up an EP1320, the on-screen graphics all switch over to the medieval ones, which is a cool wee detail, I think. The built-in medieval samples take up 96 megabytes out of the 128 megabytes that are available on the device, and they cannot be deleted as far as I'm aware. They're in ROM rather than RAM, or whatever. This leaves 32 megabytes of user addressable space for you to work with. And so as a result, this means that the medieval sampler has got double the total memory of the decidedly non-medieval themed EP133, but only half of that can actually be utilized for custom samples. Now, 32 meg does not seem like very much storage space at all. However, I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised at just how much I could cram on there. And this is coming from somebody that, you know, didn't think 1 gig in the Digitakt was enough, and it still isn't, by the way. But this is quite a different use case. Anyway, if you consider that one-shot drum samples can fairly easily be squeezed down to about 50 or so kilobytes, that gives you space for over 600 individual samples. And even if you prefer, you know, higher quality stereo sounds, which I clearly don't, then there's still a decent amount of room in there to play about with, especially considering you've then got all of these, you know, medieval samples on top of that. When it comes to how things are structured, in here we have 9 user projects. In each project, there are 4 groups represented by the letters A, B, C, and H. No, I'm just kidding, it's D. It's obviously D. Each of these 4 groups has got 12 different sample slots. They can be loaded up with any samples from the banks that we've just spoken about. These can be pitched individually or scaled and played across the keys, so you're not just stuck with whatever the starting note might be. In theory, you can mix and match and place the samples that you select on any pad that you like. However, it is worth putting a wee bit of thought into how you arrange things, because certain actions are applied to the entire group, A, B, C or D, rather than the individual pads. These parameters are indicated by the text underneath each pad, and they include things like filters, pan, level and all that. Now this is also relevant when it comes to composition, because each group relates to a separate active pattern. So in other words, here we have a 4-track sequencer with each track tied to a particular group, A through D. You program your patterns for each track and then you can switch between those on the fly. Now I know that hearing about this in the abstract might be a bit tricky. Even as I'm saying it, I don't know if I know what I'm talking about. So if we think about a really basic example, you might have lead sounds in group A, bass sounds in group B, and then drum sounds, spread across group C and D. In that kind of scenario, you could have your lead sound switch or your lead pattern switch whilst the other groups continue to play the song. If you're struggling to get your head around that, think about it kind of like 4 separate instrument tracks in Ableton, or the Poly and Play, the Akai Force or whatever else. With each of those, you can trigger separate clips or patterns independently within that track, and it's essentially the same idea. So in other words, Group A could be your synth player, Group B your bass player, and so on, with you effectively conducting and directing them to play different parts at different times. Once you have a particular combination of patterns that tickle your fancy, you can save or commit these to what teenage engineering have called a scene. This lets you build up sections of compositions that can be recalled later. In practice, this setup is actually quite powerful, and it encourages you to play about with composition in a more performance-oriented way, combining patterns, jumping between scenes, and applying some of the punch-in effects on the fly. These effects are again an adaptation of one of the features that made the original PO series so much fun, and I swear that they've done something to synchronize the effects on this so that they're much easier to play with, and that you don't need to be quite as exact with them when you trigger or release things. Or maybe I've just got much better at playing music. Who knows? These punch-in effects are great and can really add some variety to your tracks, though be aware that my understanding is that unlike on the PO33, you can't currently record punch-in effects, so they are, for now at least, a performance feature only, which is a wee bit of a shame. As well as the punch-in effects, there's also a number of global effects available, including a reverb, a delay, distortion, a chorus, a variable filter, and also a compressor. This operates kind of like a master effects bus in that you can send audio from each of your 4 tracks to whatever effect you've got selected, though one important distinction from a traditional send is that you can go from completely dry to completely wet. Unlike the punch-in effects, the fader automation here can be recorded, so you can adjust the amount of send to the global effect for each group and have that play back in the patterns, which is pretty cool. Now, there are a number of parameters that can be tweaked for each effect, and you can even apply these to the input audio. Unfortunately though, you can only have one global effect enabled at any time, and this means that it isn't possible to chain effects or have a delay on one track and a reverb on another, for example, which I feel is quite a significant limitation. Though with that said, there is also a separate master compressor, which everything runs into. Now, there are a bunch of quirks and idiosyncrasies with how scenes in particular operate, which means that it isn't always necessarily intuitive, and you do have to be pretty deliberate about how you approach writing things. For example, whenever I save or commit scene 1, the EP1320 automatically creates a copy of scene 1 into the scene 2 slot and loads that up. At the same time though, it also creates copies of all of your patterns from scene 1 to scene 2. Now this can be quite useful if you want to approach things in quite a linear fashion, composing section by section. But when writing music, I anyway often like to create a bunch of different pattern variations first, and then arrange them into sections afterwards. But doing it this way means that because of the nature of how new scenes are created, I end up with like tons of duplicate patterns which become very easy to lose track of. In other words, you can't easily just say, alright, I've written my 10 patterns for each track now. Let's create a bunch of empty scenes and arrange them so they make sense as a song, you know, a natural progression, at least not without having to contend with all of these unnecessary duplicates. There are some workarounds to this, including clearing the duplicated patterns immediately after you've committed the scene, but it still requires some manual steps. And so, from my opinion anyway, it would be much better if there was an option in here to do a kind of shallow commit, where the patterns aren't duplicated. So if you're listening out there, Teenage Engineering, perhaps that's something to consider for a future firmware update. Now I know that plenty of people out there have dismissed the EP1320 as nothing more than a novelty, or you know, just a toy as opposed to a so-called serious musical instrument. And to that I would say, well obviously, of course it's a novelty. It's a medieval themed sampler, for God's sake. Personally, I don't really understand what this obsession is with serious instruments anyway. Maybe if the likes of Stevie Aoki and all that lot were using gear like this, then EDM would be a bit less fucking boring. To be fair, I can see why some folks would write this off as just a toy because, you know, it's got this specific thematic focus, but that also kind of ignores the fact that there are loads of musicians out there that make incredible music with literal children's toys. My own gateway drug to electronica, for example, was discovering LSDJ on the Game Boy, and so whilst I get that this is, you know, not going to be for everybody, I also wouldn't be too quick to turn your nose up at it either, as underneath the cryptic symbols and curly Latin fonts, there is actually a pretty capable performance sampler in there. Having used the EP1320 a fair bit over the past few months, I have to say that I really appreciate how unique it is. It's such a novel and interesting concept that, Fadergate aside anyway, has undeniably been really well executed. With all of the prevailing popularity of medieval games and folklore, I can completely understand how there would be a legit market for this out there, and whilst I am probably not in that particular target demographic, it's also genuinely just a lot of fun to play about with. With such a large chunk of the memory constrained to particular types of sounds, that naturally puts limitations in place, but I also found that kind of inspiring in the sense that when I got it, I immediately relished the challenge of trying to create music that I actually might like within those boundaries. Could you not just download a bunch of medieval samples and load them into your DAW? Well, aye, you obviously could do that, but would you? Have you? Probably not. This is not going to be the kind of thing that will become the brain of your studio or replace your Digitact or anything like that, but not everything has to or should be aiming to do that in the first place. This is basically a themed PO33 on steroids, and I can see it being a really cool gift for somebody that likes experimenting with making music, but isn't necessarily a serious synth geek, or even just as a fun toy for somebody that is. The cost of these at the time of recording has been hovering at around about 260 Great British pounds, and for all of the criticism the teenage engineering rightly receives for their approach to pricing, I actually think that this is really pretty good value. If you like the look of the features of this thing, but aren't into all of the ye old maiden type stuff, then there's always the EP133 instead. And having used this one, I'm actually pretty interested in trying out one of those for myself as well. So I guess that's about as good a recommendation as you're going to get.